The church cost him $15. He held the deed in both hands, a single sheet of yellowed paper folded 3 times, soft at the creases as old skin, and he stood at the edge of the property in the grey October light, and he could not stop the trembling in his fingers. The building behind the rusted gate was barely a building at all. The roof had given way on the eastern side. Vines had taken the lower windows. A crow sat on what remained of the steeple and looked at him the way birds sometimes look at people who have made very poor decisions. But Daniel Marsh had held far worse things than a $15 deed. He had held a garbage bag with everything he owned at 17. He had held a wet sleeping bag under a highway overpass in February. He had held the hand of a man he barely knew who was dying in a shelter cot beside him, because there was nobody else to hold it. Those things had weight. This paper, thin as it was, felt different. Not heavy so much as pointed, like it was asking him something he had been avoiding for a long time. He folded it back into thirds and put it in his coat pocket. The crow flew away. The gate did not creak when he pushed it open because the hinges had rusted solid years ago and the whole frame simply leaned inward, slow and resigned, like a man finally agreeing to something. Daniel walked through. He did not know yet what was beneath the altar. He did not know that the sealed thing under the stone had been waiting there for 41 years, or that the answer to his own beginning was written in a language he had been taught as a child to be ashamed of. He only knew the smell of the place, cold stone and old rain, and something underneath, something almost sweet, like candle wax burned so long ago it had become part of the air itself. He would smell that sweetness again, much later, when everything changed. But to understand this, we have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the church, the beginning of Daniel. He was born in a county hospital on a Tuesday in March to a woman whose name does not appear on his birth certificate. The certificate lists only his name, Daniel James Marsh, and a date and a place, and in the line marked father it reads, in a clerk's careful handwriting, unknown. He would carry that word like a pebble in his shoe for the first 37 years of his life. Unknown. Not absent, not deceased, not refused to give name. Unknown. As though the question itself had never been asked. The woman who raised him was not his mother. Her name was Ruth, and she smelled of lavender hand cream and black coffee, and she had taken him home from a temporary care placement when he was 11 months old, and she had never once, in the 14 years that followed, made him feel like a temporary thing. She was a retired schoolteacher who lived alone in a narrow house on a street lined with silver maples, and she had a garden that produced more tomatoes than any 2 people could eat, and she gave the excess to her neighbors without being asked. Ruth had not adopted him formally. The paperwork had stalled, as paperwork does, and then the years passed and the stall became a habit, and eventually it simply was what it was. She was his person, he was hers. The documents could say whatever they liked. He knew she was sick before she told him. He was 16 when he noticed. The way she held the railing on the stairs each morning. The way she left her tea to go cold more often. The way she looked at him sometimes at dinner, long and measuring, like she was storing him up. She died 2 weeks after his 17th birthday, in a hospital bed, with his hand in hers, which was the only mercy in the whole arrangement. And then the thing that no one had prepared him for. She had no formal legal claim to him. The house passed to a distant nephew in another state, a man Daniel had met once at Christmas who wore expensive shoes and did not make eye contact with children. The nephew arrived on a Thursday with a letting agent and a brisk manner, and Daniel left that Friday with his garbage bag and the silver maple street at his back. He did not look back. That was the contradiction at the center of him, the human knot that never quite untangled. He had learned in those first lost years to move forward with such fierce deliberateness that he sometimes walked right past the things that mattered most without recognizing them. He was not hard, he was practiced. The shelter years, the soup kitchen years, the years of small labor, washing dishes, stacking pallets, mowing parks for the county. He was not, as people sometimes assumed, broken by homelessness. He was clarified by it. He learned what a person actually needed to survive, which was less than civilization suggested, and he learned which kindnesses were real and which were performances, and he learned that dignity was something you constructed from the inside out, because the outside world was not going to hand it to you. By 22, he had a room. By 26, an apartment. By 32, a small house, bought cheaply in a town nobody was moving to anymore, in a county in the western part of the state where the farms had gone to seed and the main street had more closed storefronts than open ones. He worked for a building restoration firm. He had taught himself the trade from manuals and YouTube videos and long conversations with older workers who were glad of someone who listened. He was good with his hands and patient with rot, which is the primary qualification for the work. He understood that most damage is slower than it looks, that a wall that appears destroyed often has good bones underneath, that the key is knowing the difference between what is genuinely lost and what has only been neglected. He had lived in the same small house for 5 years when the church came to him. He had not gone looking for it. He had been driving back from a site assessment, a farmhouse on a county road, and he had taken a wrong turn on a gravel road that curved through a stand of old oaks and dead-ended at a chain-link fence with a faded real estate notice zip-tied to it. The notice was from 4 years ago. The price had been crossed out twice and rewritten, lower each time, and someone had added at the bottom, in blue marker, $15, taxes paid, take it. He sat in his truck for a long time looking at it. The church itself was visible through the fence, white clapboard gone grey, the steeple intact except for its crown, the windows mostly boarded, the front steps buckled by frost and tree roots. It had the particular look of a thing that had been prayed in, and then prayed over, and then abandoned while the prayers were still, somehow, in the walls. He wrote down the phone number from the notice. That night he sat at his kitchen table with the number on a piece of paper and a cup of coffee he had made, but not drunk, and he thought about reasons not to call. He was 37 years old. He had no family to consult. He had savings, carefully built, enough for 2 years of modest living if he was careful. He had a job and a small house and the approximate shape of a life. There was no rational reason to buy a ruined church for $15. He called the next morning. The man who answered was a county official named Gerald, who sounded both surprised and intensely relieved, and told Daniel that the church had been on the county's books as an abandoned liability for 9 years, that the previous owner had died without heirs and left no instructions, that the county had been quietly hoping someone would take it, and that $15 was not really the price of the church so much as the price of the county's paperwork, which was also, Gerald admitted, in a state of disrepair. "What denomination?" Daniel asked. Gerald paused. "I'd have to look that up." "How old?" Another pause. "Old," Gerald said. "We'd have to look that up too." It was a satisfying transaction, as transactions go. Two people equally uncertain, choosing anyway. The deed was transferred on a Wednesday. Daniel drove out that same afternoon with a torch and a notebook and a thermos of tea, because he was the kind of man who brought a thermos to a ruin. He pushed open the leaning gate. He walked across the overgrown yard. He stood at the front steps of the church and looked up at the door. It was oak. Heavy old-growth oak, dark with age and green at the hinges with moss, but the wood itself was sound. He put his palm flat against it and felt the grain beneath his hand, the slight give of a century of weather without going soft. Good oak. Deep roots, long patience. He pushed the door open. The smell hit him first, cold stone and old rain, and underneath that, the sweetness, wax and dust and time. The inside of the church was a single long room, the nave, with wooden pews still in place, most of them warped by years of moisture but still standing. The plaster walls had lost great patches, and the lath beneath showed through like ribs. The eastern section of the roof had indeed collapsed, and a square of open sky showed through, and below it a mound of debris, plaster, rotted timbers, bird nests, had accumulated on what had once been the choir floor. But the western end, the altar end, was intact. The altar itself was simple, a plain stone table on a raised platform of 3 steps. Grey stone, nothing ornate about it. Behind it, attached to the wall, was a large wooden cross, old enough that the wood had gone almost black. And on either side of the altar, 2 iron candlesticks, each about 4 feet high, still standing, still bearing the blackened stubs of candles so old they had fused with the iron. Daniel stood in the doorway a long time. He walked to the altar slowly, stepping over fallen plaster and the remains of a pew that had split at the center. He ran his hand along the stone surface of the altar table. It was cold, deeply cold, the way stone is when it has not been warmed by human presence for years. Rough at the edges, smooth in the center where generations of hands had laid flowers, candles, offerings. He crouched and looked at the base of the altar. The stone platform, the plinth on which the table sat, was a single large block, maybe 3 feet by 4, a different shade of grey from the altar surface. And along the base of it, running the full width, was a line of mortar that looked newer than everything else. Not new exactly, but newer. The mortar was clean, without the dark staining of age, and whoever had applied it had pressed it down carefully, deliberately, as though they had wanted the seal to hold. Daniel sat on the floor in front of it and looked at it for a long time. He had a feeling he had learned to trust, a quiet, physical certainty, low in the chest, not excitement but something more careful. That this particular detail was not accidental. He wrote it down in his notebook. Then he made himself stand up and tour the rest of the building, because good practice is good practice, and because he had learned a long time ago that the thing you want to reach for first is usually the thing you should look at last. He spent 2 weeks doing preliminary work. He reinforced the collapsed eastern section with a temporary timber frame to stop further deterioration. He cleared the debris from the choir floor. He replaced 2 window boards that had blown loose. He bought a gas heater and set it up in the nave and spent 3 evenings simply sitting in the warmed space, letting the building tell him what it needed, which is something he had learned to do from an old carpenter named Emmett, who had worked with him on a farmhouse restoration and had told him once, in a voice of complete seriousness, that buildings hold information the same way people do. You just have to learn to listen without agenda. He had not told anyone about the sealed base of the altar. There was, in the town 4 miles away, a woman named Claire who ran the local historical society from 2 rooms above the hardware store. He had stopped in once for maps of the county, and she had given him 3 maps, 2 books, a local archive guide, and her opinion on 5 related subjects, all of it offered with the particular generosity of someone who has spent years guarding knowledge that nobody asks for. He went back. "The old Malone Church," she said without hesitation when he described the location. "You know it? Everyone who's been here long enough knows it." She said it the way people say things they have been waiting to say. She was already moving toward a filing cabinet, her keys jangling. It was built in 1887 by a congregation of Irish immigrants, mostly families who'd come for the rail labor. The parish was active until the 1970s. After that, she found a folder and opened it on the counter. After that, it gets complicated. She showed him a photograph, black and white, undated, showing the church in its prime, the white clapboard gleaming, a group of perhaps 30 people arranged on the front steps, men in dark suits, women in pale dresses, children at the edges looking away from the camera with the particular restlessness of children who have been told to stand still. "What happened in the 1970s?" Daniel asked. Claire's expression changed, a slight narrowing. "There was a dispute," she said, careful with the word, "over the building, over what it should become. The congregation had mostly dispersed by then. The young people had moved to the cities. There was a man, the last acting pastor, Father Cormac Brennan, who wanted the building preserved and given to the County Historical Trust. There were others who wanted to sell the land for development. It got unpleasant. Father Brennan died before it was resolved. And then the disputes over the estate stalled everything, and eventually it just sat. When did Father Brennan die? She checked the folder. 1983. 41 years ago. The same age as the newer mortar. Daniel kept his face still. "Do you have any records from the church itself? Parish records, anything?" "Some." She pulled a second folder. Birth records, death records, some correspondence. But there are gaps. Father Brennan took several boxes of documents when the congregation dispersed. They were never returned. No one knows what became of them. He drove home slowly through the bare-limbed oaks, thinking about a man who takes boxes of documents and seals something under an altar and dies before the dispute is resolved. He thought about the mortar. He thought about the word unknown on his own birth certificate. These were separate thoughts. He did not yet connect them. That night he found, in Clare's archive copies, a list of the Malone parish families. Long Irish names, mostly. Families who had arrived in the 1880s and stayed for 2 or 3 generations. Kellys, Murphys, Brennans, O'Sullivans, Coughlins. And there, on the 3rd page of the register, in entries from the late 1970s, a baptism record for a male infant, unnamed, born to a woman listed only as MC. The date of the baptism was February 1978. There was a note in the margin, in the same handwriting as the rest of the register, which said, in Latin, Commendatus Deo, entrusted to God. Daniel was born in March 1978. He sat at his kitchen table for a very long time. The coffee went cold. The gas heater ticked in the kitchen corner. Outside, the October wind moved through the silver maples he had planted along his front fence the first spring he had owned the house, because Ruth had had silver maples, and because some things you carry forward without choosing to. He did not sleep that night. He lay in the dark and felt the connection forming, the way a crack forms in old plaster, slowly at first, then definite. He did not want to be reckless about it. He was practiced at not being reckless. He had learned at 17 that hope with no foundation is its own kind of damage. But the mortar under the altar, 41 years old, the same as him. He went back to the church the next morning before dawn with a cold chisel and a hammer and a work lamp, and the understanding that whatever was under that stone had been placed there by someone who expected it to be found, eventually, by the right person. The church was colder than ever. His breath showed in the lamplight. He set the lamp on the altar table and crouched in front of the plinth and studied the mortar line for a long time. It had been applied professionally, carefully, pressed smooth, but there was a section on the right-hand side where the mortar was slightly thinner, and Daniel had enough experience with sealed things to recognize a point of intended entry, the place where someone expected a chisel to go. He placed the chisel there. He tapped it once, gently, with the hammer. The mortar gave. He worked slowly. He was patient with old things. He had learned that patience is its own form of respect. The mortar came out in pieces, chalky and grey, landing on the stone floor with small sounds in the silence of the empty church. He worked for 30 minutes. The crow was back somewhere in the upper section of the building. He could hear it moving. And once, unexpectedly, a car passed on the gravel road outside, and he stopped and held still for a moment before continuing. When the mortar was fully cleared, the plinth sat loose in its channel. He worked his fingers under the front edge and lifted. The stone was heavier than it looked. He repositioned his hands, found his footing on the cold floor, and lifted again. It came up, not easily, but with the specific resistance of a thing that has been held down for a long time and is no longer sure it wants to be moved. Underneath was a cavity, roughly 18 inches square and perhaps a foot deep, cut into the stone foundation with precision. Inside the cavity, a metal box. It was a deed box, the kind used by solicitors in an earlier era. Black painted metal with a flat lid and a simple latch, not locked. It was cold to the touch, deeply cold, cold in the way that things are when they have never known warmth. He lifted it with both hands and set it on the altar table. It weighed perhaps 4 or 5 pounds. Something shifted inside when he tilted it. Paper. He did not open it immediately. He stood in the cold church and looked at the box on the stone altar, and he thought about Ruth and her lavender hand cream and the silver maples on the street and the word unknown on the document that was supposed to tell him who he was. Then he opened the latch. Inside the box, arranged with care, were 6 items. The first was an envelope, sealed with wax and written on the front in a careful elderly hand. For the child. To be opened when he is old enough to understand that mercy sometimes looks like silence. The second was a small photograph, black and white, of a young woman, perhaps 25, dark-haired, looking slightly to the left of the camera with an expression that managed to be both frightened and entirely determined. The third was a handwritten letter, 4 pages, the ink brown with age. The fourth was a legal document, folded flat, bearing an official stamp. The fifth was a small wooden cross, simple, polished from handling, with a name carved into the back, Cormac. The sixth was a map of the county, old with a single property circled in red ink, and a note in the margin that said, in the same handwriting as the envelope, his grandfather's land, paid for, never surrendered. Tax records in the county office under the name Michael Coughlin, 1947 onwards. Daniel held the photograph. The young woman looked back at him from across 40 years with her dark hair and her frightened, determined expression, and he recognized something in the set of her jaw. The way she was bracing herself, holding herself very still in the middle of something that was moving too fast. Because he had felt that expression from the inside many times. He opened the letter. Father Cormac Brennan had a precise, unhurried hand. The letter was dated March 1983, 7 months before his death. It began, "If you are reading this, then the right hand's found it. I have believed in God long enough to think that things placed with faith end up where they are meant to." The young woman in the photograph was named Maya Coughlin. She had been 23 when she came to him, which would have been in the autumn of 1977. She was the granddaughter of Michael Coughlin, who had been among the first families of the original parish, and she was pregnant and alone, and the man who had fathered the child had refused to acknowledge it. And her family, her immediate family, not old Michael, who was by then in a nursing home and beyond understanding the situation, had sent her away. She had come to Father Brennan because she had nowhere else to go, and because the Coughlin family had been part of the Malone parish for 3 generations, and because she believed, in the way that young people sometimes believe despite all the evidence, that the church would help her. He had helped her as much as he could. He had found a placement for her in the city, a woman who took in young mothers in difficulty, a good woman, Brennan wrote, without sentimentality but with warmth. He had accompanied Mare to the hospital in February and held her hand and been there when the child was born, a boy, healthy and loud, and Mare had held the baby for 2 hours, and then, because she had no money and no home to return to and no prospect of either, she had allowed the placement to be arranged. The child went to a temporary care arrangement. The mother went back to the city. Father Brennan had never lost track of either. He had written to Mare every year. He had tracked the child through the care system, quietly, through a network of parish contacts that was, he noted without judgment, more effective than any official system. He knew the child had gone to Ruth. He knew the child was safe. He called the child, in his private notes, by the name Mare had whispered to him in the hospital, before the placement, when she was still holding him, Dai Thi, which was the old name, the Irish name, which in English becomes approximately David or Daniel. He had intended to tell the child everything when the child was old enough. He had intended to restore the Coughlin land. Michael Coughlin had died in 1979 and left the land to his granddaughter Mare in a will that her family had quietly and illegally suppressed, which Father Brennan had discovered and documented, and those documents were the legal papers in the box. He had intended to reconnect mother and son. He had not had time. The letter ended. "I seal this here because the church is the only thing in this dispute that no one can sell from under me. The land belongs to Maya and therefore to her child. The documents prove it. I do not know who will read this or when, but the Coughlin land has been paid for since 1947 and it has never been surrendered, and I will not allow it to be taken quietly while I have hands to prevent it. God keep the child. Tell him his mother never stopped." If you have come this far in Daniel's story, stay a little longer. What happened next was not the end of the loss. It was the beginning of something else, something that had been growing in the dark under a stone for 40 years, waiting for the right hands. Daniel sat on the steps of the altar in the cold church with the letter in his hands and the photograph on the stone beside him, and he did not cry. Not immediately. He sat very still in the way that people sit when the ground has shifted and they have not yet decided how to stand on the new surface. He read the letter again. Slower this time. The crow had gone quiet somewhere above him. The early morning light was coming through the intact windows on the western wall, the pale October light, falling in long rectangles across the dusty pew tops, moving slowly as the sun moved. He picked up the photograph again and held it in the light. Mare, frightened and determined, and 23 years old and holding herself very still, in the middle of something moving too fast. He knew that photograph. He had been living inside that expression for 37 years without knowing what to call it. He put the photograph back in the box. He put the letter on top of it, and the legal papers, and the little wooden cross with Cormac carved into the back. He closed the lid. He held the box on his knees for a moment, feeling its weight, 4 or 5 pounds, a life secret. And then he stood and carried it to his truck. He needed to find Claire. She was at the Historical Society when he arrived, opening the door with her ring of keys, carrying a paper cup of tea from the bakery below. She looked at him, at his face, at the metal box under his arm, and she unlocked the door without a word and held it open for him. "Sit down," she said, setting her tea on the desk. She looked at the box. "Where did you find it?" "Under the altar." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Under the altar." "Sealed with mortar, 40-odd years." She looked at him properly then, really looked. And something in her face shifted, a recognition or the beginning of one, because Claire had been the local historian for 22 years. And she had grown up in this county, and she knew the names in these parishes the way some people know their own family. She said carefully, "The Coughlin land." Daniel did not answer. He put the box on her desk and opened the lid. She read the letter slowly, the way she would read any document in her care, which was to say with full attention and without performance. She did not make sounds. She turned the pages. She looked at the photograph for a long time. When she was finished, she looked up and said simply, "Your middle name?" "James." "Dythy means David." In older usage, it was sometimes rendered as Daniel James. She said it the matter-of-fact way she said most things. "The Coughlin land is the property circled on that map, about 80 acres. There has been a land use dispute on it for the past 15 years. A development company has been trying to buy it, but the title has been held in a kind of legal limbo because no legitimate heir ever came forward to claim the Coughlin estate." Daniel looked at the map. "The documents in that box," Claire continued, "establish paternity, prove the suppression of Michael Coughlin's original will, and name Mayor Coughlin as the legitimate heir, which means the land passes to her child." She let the silence sit for a moment. "If her child is alive," she said. He drove to the county office that afternoon. The records were exactly where Father Brennan had said they would be. Michael Coughlin, 1947 onwards, tax records, land records, a chain of title clear as a river in dry season. The county clerk, a young woman who looked barely older than Daniel had been when he left the Silver Maple Street, pulled the files without question and laid them on the counter and stepped back to let him look. And then he drove home, and he sat at the kitchen table and he picked up his phone. He had not looked for Mayer. He had thought about it over the years, in the general way that people who did not know their origins sometimes think about it. A room in the mind they open occasionally and then close again because the questions are larger than the answers available. He had never taken the actual steps. He had told himself it was because Ruth had been enough, which was true and also, like most true things, incomplete. He opened a browser. He typed the name. Mayor Coughlin was 60 years old. She lived in the city, 40 miles from where Daniel was sitting. She had a professional profile. She worked as a social care administrator, which, when Daniel read it, produced a sensation like a cord pulled tight in his chest. She had spent 30 years working in the care system, advocating for young people in difficult placements, pushing for reform in the way temporary arrangements were handled. He looked at the small profile photograph for a long time. The jaw was exactly the same, still held in that particular way, still bracing. He wrote an email. He deleted it. He wrote another. He deleted that too. He was not a man who struggled with words as a rule. He was precise and plain in his speech. But there is no plain way to write. "I think I am the child you held for 2 hours in a hospital in February 1978, and a priest hid documents under an altar for 40 years to protect your inheritance, and I found them last week, and I have your photograph." He wrote it anyway, as plainly as that. And he sent it before he could change his mind. She replied 11 minutes later. The reply said, "I know. I've been looking for you for 9 years. The email address I had for the care coordinator was wrong. I need you to know something before we speak." I never stopped. He read those last 4 words, and he set the phone face down on the table, and he pressed both hands flat on the wood, and he breathed. 3 words from a priest's letter, and 4 words from a stranger who was not a stranger, and 37 years of moving forward with such fierce deliberateness that he had walked past the thing that mattered most. He felt it now, not as grief, not as anger, but as something that had been knotted for a very long time and was, slowly, without drama, beginning to loosen. He picked the phone up and called her number. She answered on the second ring. He said, "It's Daniel." She said, "I know your voice. I've been imagining it for a long time." They talked for 3 hours. He walked around his small house while they talked, the way people do when they're containing something large. From the kitchen to the hallway, to the back garden and back again, the dead grass cold under his boots, the sky darkening overhead. She told him everything. He told her what he could. When he told her about Ruth, the silver maples, the lavender hand cream, the way she had looked at him at dinner like she was storing him up. Maya was quiet for a long time, and then she said, her voice very even, "She sounds like someone who understood what it meant to do a thing properly, even when the system made it impossible," which was the most Ruth sentence Daniel had ever heard from someone who had never met Ruth, and he had to stop walking and stand still in the cold, dark garden for a moment. The Coughlin land matter took 8 months to resolve. There was a solicitor named Harper who specialized in suppressed wills and title disputes, and who, when Daniel arrived in his office with the contents of Father Brennan's deed box, looked at the documents the way certain professionals look at something they have been waiting a long time to see, with controlled satisfaction. The development company's claim dissolved quickly once the legal suppression of Michael Coughlin's original will was established. The county archives confirmed the chain of title. Harper filed in February. The judgment came in September. 82 acres of land that had been paid for since 1947 and never surrendered was formally transferred to Maya Coughlin and her son. Daniel and Maya met for the first time in April, 5 months before the judgment. He had offered to travel to the city. She had suggested coming to him, and he had agreed. And then he had spent a week anxious about the small house and the garden that was just beginning to come up, and the coffee he was going to offer her, and whether that was the right thing to offer. He had cleaned the house 3 times without noticing he was doing it. She arrived on a Saturday morning in a small car she parked carefully on the gravel. She was shorter than he had imagined from the photograph. She had grey in her dark hair now. She walked to the door, and he opened it before she knocked, because he had been watching from the window without admitting to himself that he was watching from the window. They stood looking at each other for a moment in the April light. She said, "You have the Coughlin jaw." He said, "I know." She came in. He made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table that he had sat at 100 times alone, and she looked around the small kitchen with its gas heater and its scrubbed surfaces and the photograph of Ruth on the shelf above the window, the only photograph he kept anywhere, and she looked at it a long time. "She gave you a good start," Mara said, "in the years that mattered." "She gave me everything," Daniel said. They drank their coffee at the table. They talked, and then fell quiet, and then talked again. Outside, the silver maples he had planted along the front fence were putting out their first leaves of the season, small and pale green in the morning light, trembling in a slight wind. He had not told Mare about the maples. She noticed them when she was leaving. She stopped at the gate and looked at them, 5 silver maples planted in a line, not yet 5 years old but already reaching. "I used to know someone," Daniel said, "who had silver maples outside her house. I planted these my first spring here." Mare looked at them a moment longer. Then she looked at him. She said nothing, but her hand just briefly pressed his arm once as she passed through the gate. He stood at the gate and watched her small car move away down the road and disappear between the oaks. A year passed. The church was not a ruin anymore. Daniel had worked on it through the winter and into the spring and through the summer, a slow process, correct in every step, because there was no other way he knew how to work. He had rebuilt the collapsed eastern section with reclaimed timber matched as closely as possible to the original structure. He had replastered the walls, lime render over the original lath, the right mixture, the old way, so that the walls would breathe. He had restored the windows, not with new glass, but with period glass, sourced from a salvage yard, imperfect and wavy and full of light in a way that modern glass never quite is. He had kept the altar exactly as it was. He had not touched the stone table or the iron candlesticks or the old dark cross behind them. Only the base of the plinth he had left open, the cavity cleaned and empty, its purpose spent, like a question that had been answered and did not need to be filled in. Claire had written a historical society report on the Malone Church, its origins, the Coughlin family, Father Brennan's role in the parish, and the documents recovered from beneath the altar. She had been thorough and precise, as she was in everything. The report was deposited in the county archive. On an October morning, a year to the month from the day he had pushed open the leaning gate for the first time, Daniel unlocked the church and went inside. The building smelled different now, lime plaster and fresh timber and beeswax from the candles he had replaced in the iron holders. The same iron holders, cleaned of rust, set with new candles, burning this morning for the first time in decades. The light through the wavy period glass fell in long soft rectangles across the pew tops, fractured and warm, moving slowly as the sun moved. Mare arrived at 10. She had a habit now of simply arriving, which he had come to understand was her way of saying she trusted the welcome. She stood in the open doorway of the church and looked at what it had become, and she was very quiet for a long time. He would have wanted this, she said eventually. Daniel understood she meant Father Brennan. "There's something I want to show you," he said. He led her to the altar and crouched beside the open base of the plinth and pointed. She crouched beside him and looked at the empty cavity in the stone, the clean-cut walls of it, the flat base. "He did a good job," Mare said. "Whoever cut this out? 100 years old and the stone was still sound. Good bones." She looked at him, and there was something in her expression that was neither grief nor happiness exactly, but the particular quality of a person who has been holding themselves braced for a very long time and has decided now, finally, to put the weight down. He showed her the small wooden cross last. It had been on his kitchen shelf since October, the cross with Cormac carved into the back, smooth from years of a priest's hands. He had carried it to the church that morning and set it on the altar table where it sat in the beeswax candlelight, very small and very plain. She picked it up without asking. She turned it over and read the name with her thumb, tracing the carved letters. She set it back on the altar. Daniel stood beside his mother in the church that had cost him $15 and that had given him back, one piece at a time, the things he had not known he had lost. The candles burned. The window light moved across the stone floor. He had been homeless at 17 with a garbage bag and an unknown on a piece of paper where his beginning should have been. He had bought a ruin for the price of a paperwork fee. He had lifted a stone and found 40 years of safeguarded truth waiting in the cold. Ruth had a saying she repeated on the evenings when Daniel brought her problems that seemed too large for their narrow house. She would put her lavender hands around her coffee cup and look at him across the kitchen table and say, "Most broken things aren't broken. They're just waiting for someone with enough patience to look properly." He had thought about that saying many times in his life. He thought about it now, standing in the restored light of the Malone Church, with the smell of beeswax candles in the air and the carved cross on the stone altar and his mother beside him. Silent and solid, and finally still. He folded nothing away. He moved toward nothing. He simply stood there in the light, in the place that had waited 40 years for the right hands, and let it be enough. Most broken things aren't broken. They're just waiting. If this story stayed,